Montana, late winter, early 1970s. This was the kind of cold that didn't surprise anyone, but it punished every mistake. In Flathead County, builders were still using the same approach they always had. Light wood frames, thin insulation, basements that were treated like afterthoughts, metal structures everyone avoided for living space. And every winter the results were the same. Homes that lost heat faster than stoves could replace it. Basements that stayed cold no matter how much wood you burned upstairs. Families waking up in the dark to reload fires because letting them die meant waking up to a 40-degree house. Most people accepted it. That was just winter. But one build going up on the edge of the valley didn't look like anything else around it. And from the start, people said it was a mistake. What they saw was a curved steel shell sitting on top of a stone basement. No traditional roofline, no wood-framed upper walls, no poured concrete slab sealing the basement from the ground. It looked more like a military structure than a home. Contractors drove past and shook their heads. A few stopped to say it out loud. "That thing's going to sweat. That basement will never warm up. You're building a freezer with a metal lid." To them, this wasn't innovation. It was stacking two known problems on top of each other. Stone basements were known to go cold and stay cold. Everyone had walked into one in February and felt the chill climb straight up their legs. Metal buildings were cheap surplus from the war, but no one lived in them for a reason. Condensation soaked the interior. Frost formed on the ribs. Anything organic inside rotted. Putting the two together looked reckless. But the man building it wasn't guessing. He wasn't chasing novelty, and he wasn't trying to prove anyone wrong. He was responding to what he had seen for years. Houses that burned fuel non-stop and still failed at the one thing they were supposed to do: keep people warm. By the time the frame was up and the stonework was finished, the comments got sharper. People weren't just skeptical anymore. They were certain that structure wouldn't last a winter. What none of them realized was that this design wasn't fighting cold the way they were. It was built to let cold exist without letting it matter. And before that winter was over, the valley would learn the difference. The builder's name mattered less than what he had lived through. He wasn't a theorist. He wasn't reading design books or chasing new trends. He was a working tradesman who had spent years inside Montana houses during Montana winters. He had framed homes in summer heat. He had repaired roofs after windstorms. He had welded steel when wood failed. And every winter he saw the same pattern repeat. People didn't heat their homes, they fed them. 16-hour burn days just to stay barely comfortable. Wood piles shrinking faster than expected. Families clustered near the stove because the rest of the house never caught up. The basements were always worse. Stone foundations everyone trusted turned into cold sinks. Heat moved downward into the ground instead of staying where people lived. No matter how hard you worked the stove upstairs, the cold below pulled everything down with it. Concrete slabs made it worse. Thin pores, no separation from frozen soil. They acted like heat highways straight into the earth. And yet builders kept repeating it. Metal structures weren't even considered. Everyone had seen them used as sheds or equipment storage. In winter they were soaked inside. Frost on the ribs. Water dripping from the ceiling as soon as the sun hit. To most people that settled it. Metal didn't belong where people slept. But this builder had spent years welding barn silos and arched steel structures. He knew metal wasn't the problem. Moisture was. Air movement was. Bad insulation was. And shape mattered more than most people admitted. He had been inside properly insulated, curved steel buildings that stayed dry and tight, through storms that rattled framed houses apart. No corners for wind to grab. no roof valleys for snow to pile up. What bothered him wasn't tradition, it was inefficiency. He had watched neighbors burn 4, 5, even 6 cords of wood and still complain about cold floors and frozen basements. He had seen families set alarms every 3 hours all winter long. That wasn't toughness, that was waste. He didn't want a house that proved he could endure winter. He wanted one that worked while he slept. And that meant questioning everything people said you had to do. What if stone didn't have to be cold? What if metal didn't have to sweat? What if the ground itself could help instead of hurt? Those weren't abstract questions, they were practical ones. And the answers were older than Montana itself. Most builders in the valley thought they understood stone. They had worked with it for decades. They had stacked it into foundations, cellars, retaining walls. And every winter those spaces felt the same cold, damp, forgotten until spring. So the conclusion was easy. Stone goes cold and stays cold. But that conclusion came from shallow walls, thin construction, and direct contact with frozen ground. It wasn't stone failing, it was design failing. This builder had seen something different on older sites. Thick walls, deep foundations, earth-packed cellars that didn't freeze, even when the air above dropped far below zero. 8 feet down the ground didn't care about winter. It stayed steady, not warm but stable, and stability mattered. 48 to 52 degrees year-round wasn't enough to heat a house by itself, but it was a massive advantage when everything above ground was trying to pull heat away. Stone placed correctly didn't drain heat, it stored it. The same thinking applied to metal. People blamed steel for condensation because they saw water dripping inside uninsulated sheds. But steel didn't create moisture. Warm air did. And when warm, wet air hit a cold surface without a barrier, it condensed. That was basic physics. Insulate properly, control vapor, move air with intention. Do that and metal became something else entirely. A continuous shell. No studs bridging heat to the outside. No roofline full of gaps and angles. Just a smooth arch that shed snow-cut wind and held what you put inside. The problem wasn't the materials. It was how people used them. Once that became clear, the idea stopped sounding risky. Stone below where the earth stayed calm. Steel above shaped to resist weather instead of fighting it. Mass paired with efficiency. Old knowledge paired with surplus materials. By the fall of the early 70s, the decision was made. He wasn't going to build another house that demanded constant attention just to survive winter. He was going to build something that worked quietly day and night, whether anyone believed in it or not. He started with the part everyone else rushed, the basement. Most houses in the valley treated the foundation as something to get past as fast as possible. Dig shallow, pour thin, move on. The goal was speed, not performance. He did the opposite. He went down 8 feet into solid ground, not fill, not loose soil, stable earth that didn't shift and didn't freeze. That depth mattered. Below the frost line, the ground stayed calm all year. No wild temperature swings, no sudden cold spikes, just steady, predictable conditions. Then came the walls. Not concrete forms, not blocks stacked thin and hollow. He used local stone-heavy pieces, each one taking effort to move. The walls went up thick, close to 2 feet in places. That wasn't for looks. Weight was the point. Stone like that didn't react quickly. It absorbed heat slowly and gave it back even slower. That was exactly what he wanted. He left the floor as compacted earth. No slab to pull heat downward. No concrete acting like a conductor straight into cold ground. The soil itself stayed near 50 degrees year-round, insulated by the earth above and below it. Small windows went into the south side of the basement. Not for views, for winter sun. Low-angle light that could reach deep inside during the coldest months. And at the center, he built the heart of the system. Not a steel stove meant to burn fast and hot. Not something that demanded constant feeding. He built a masonry heater brick firebox, long internal flue paths, designed to hold heat instead of dumping it outside. When that heater burned, it didn't blast heat into the air and disappear up the chimney. It soaked the surrounding mass. Brick, stone, earth. One fire charged the system for an entire day. He wasn't trying to make the basement hot. That would have wasted energy. He was aiming for warm enough to let heat rise naturally, warm enough to feed the space above without effort, warm enough to stay steady when everything outside dropped hard. By the time the stone walls were finished, the basement already felt different. Not cozy, not finished, but calm. And that calm was exactly what the rest of the house would rely on. Most people think heating is about making air hot. That's the mistake. Hot air rises, cools fast, and disappears just as quickly as you create it. That's why metal stoves need constant feeding. You stop burning, the heat vanishes. He wasn't interested in that cycle. What he wanted was storage. The masonry heater was built for that purpose. Inside, the fire burned hard and clean for a short time. The heat didn't rush out the chimney. It was forced through a long internal path, transferring energy into brick before it ever reached the flue. That brick mass stayed warm for hours. The stone walls around it did the same. Each firing slowly charged thousands of pounds of material, not instantly, not dramatically, but thoroughly. This wasn't a basement meant to be lived in all day. It was a thermal reservoir. He brought the temperature up to the low 60s and stopped there. No pushing it higher, no wasting fuel. At that level, the stone radiated steady warmth without overheating the space. The heat moved where it was needed, rising naturally through the open stairwell into the living area above. Nothing mechanical pushed it, no fans, no ducts. Warm air rose, cooler air sank. The cycle repeated itself on its own. The earth around the basement helped too. 8 feet down, the soil stayed stable. It didn't steal heat, it buffered it. The basement wasn't fighting frozen ground. It was insulated from it. What he built worked the way old systems worked, slow, predictable, reliable. Once the fire was out, the house didn't cool off the way everyone expected. The walls held their charge. The heaters stayed warm to the touch. The temperature dropped gradually instead of crashing. This was the difference between active heat and stored heat. One required constant effort. The other rewarded patience. And with the basement finished, the foundation for the rest of the structure was already doing its job before anyone even noticed. Once the basement was finished, most people expected a normal house to rise on top of it. Instead, they watched steel arrive. Prefabricated curved ribs, corrugated panels, parts that looked like they belonged on a military site, not a homestead. That alone unsettled people. Metal buildings had a reputation, and not a good one. Everyone in the county had walked into a Quonset used as a storage shed in winter and seen frost lining the inside ribs, water dripping when the sun came out, tools rusting, wood rotting. That's what people remembered. What they didn't remember or never learned was why it happened. Condensation wasn't caused by steel. It was caused by warm, moist air hitting a cold surface with nowhere else to go. So he planned for that from the start. The steel shell went directly on top of the stone walls, sealed tight along the joint. No gaps, no shortcuts. The connection mattered. Any air leak there would ruin the system. Inside the arch, he insulated heavily. 6 inches, not 2. Then came a proper vapor barrier placed on the warm side exactly where it belonged. Every seam sealed. Every joint treated like it mattered because it did. Then the interior finish went up. Wood paneling not for looks, but because it protected the barrier and added a small layer of thermal buffering. The shape of the structure did the rest. No flat roof to collect snow, no sharp corners for wind to grab. Snow slid off. Wind flowed over and around instead of pushing in. He added controlled ventilation at both ends, not holes. Vents that could be opened or closed depending on conditions. Moist air from cooking and bathing had a path out before it ever touched cold steel. This wasn't guesswork. It was moisture management. By the time the shell was closed in the interior, already felt different from any metal building people remembered. Dry, still, tight. The steel wasn't the enemy. Uncontrolled air was. And once that was handled, the structure above the basement became exactly what it was meant to be, a lid that held heat and not a surface that gave it away. This is the part most people misunderstood. They assumed the goal was to make the house warm fast, to push heat hard and keep pushing it until winter backed off. That was never the plan. He wasn't chasing 70 degrees by force. He was building a system that stayed steady without constant input. The basement wasn't heated like a living room, it was charged. He brought it up into the low 60s and stopped there. Any hotter would have wasted wood. Any cooler wouldn't have fed the space above efficiently. Stone doesn't work on short timelines. It doesn't respond to quick changes. That's its strength. Once it was warm, it stayed warm. And because it was insulated from frozen ground, it didn't dump that heat outward. It released it inward slowly, evenly. Heat rose up the open stairwell into the steel shell above, not in a rush, not in bursts, just a constant upward flow. The upper level didn't need its own stove. It didn't need ductwork or fans. The structure itself guided the air. Warm air rose into the living space. Cooler air settled back down toward the basement, where it was reheated by stone and brick. The cycle never stopped. He also paid attention to small things most builders ignored. The exterior stone stairs were built with an air gap, not solid contact. That break mattered. Direct stone-to-stone contact would have carried cold straight into the basement wall. Doors were sealed tight. Not fancy, just effective. Any uncontrolled air leak would have undercut the entire system. Even the interior layout mattered. Open space above the stairwell allowed heat to move freely, instead of being trapped behind walls and doors. Nothing about this was accidental. Every decision pointed to the same goal: reduce swings. No spikes, no crashes, no panic reloads in the middle of the night. By the time the structure was finished, the system was already working quietly. What remained was the test everyone had been waiting for. Winter. Up until December, people still argued in theory. They talked about what would happen when it got cold. They predicted condensation. They warned about frozen walls and damp air. Some said it might hold together for a while, but not through a real Montana winter. Then winter arrived. Not gently, not gradually. Temperatures dropped fast and stayed down. Nights went well below zero. Daytime highs barely climbed out of the negatives, the kind of cold that doesn't give buildings time to recover. Across the valley, routines shifted. Wood stoves ran non-stop. People shortened their sleep because fires needed feeding. Doors stayed closed. Rooms were abandoned. The wind made it worse. It found every weak joint and pulled heat straight out of framed houses. Snow piled against walls. Frost crept along window frames and door jambs. This was the stretch of winter that broke pipes and budgets. And this was when everyone expected the stone and steel house to fail. People assumed the metal shell would frost over inside, that moisture would show up first at the ceiling, that the basement would turn cold once the ground above froze solid. None of that happened. Inside, the temperature didn't swing the way it did in other houses. It didn't spike when the stove burned and crash when the fire died. It stayed level. One firing of the masonry heater carried the house through the day, sometimes into the next. The stone basement stayed warm to the touch. The air upstairs felt even not sharp or dry. There was no dripping, no frost lines, no damp smell. The curved roof shed snow as fast as it fell. Wind slid over it instead of pressing against it. The steel skin stayed cold on the outside and dry on the inside exactly as it was supposed to. While neighbors were waking up every few hours to reload fires, he slept through the night. Not because he was lucky, because the house wasn't depending on constant effort to survive. As the cold settled in deeper, word started moving through the valley. Quietly, at first, then more openly. People wanted to know one thing. How was it holding up now? The first visit wasn't friendly. One of the most experienced stone men in the county came by during the worst stretch of cold. Not to help, not to learn. He wanted to see the failure for himself. He expected to find someone burning wood non-stop, fighting moisture, struggling to stay ahead of the cold. Instead, the door opened and the man inside wasn't bundled up. The temperature inside the steel shell was steady, comfortable. No blast of heat, no roaring fire, just even warmth. The first question was simple. How much wood are you burning? The answer didn't make sense. One firing the day before, nothing since. That wasn't how winter worked around there. Not at those temperatures, not with that wind. Everyone else was feeding fires every few hours just to stay above 45. The visitor stepped inside. He checked the ceiling first. No frost, no dampness, no drip lines running down the ribs. Dry wood, warm air. Then he went downstairs. The masonry heater was warm, not hot. You could rest your hand on it. The stone walls radiated gentle heat. Not the sharp blast of a stove, but the kind of warmth you feel standing near a sunlit wall. The floor was dry, the air was still. The basement wasn't pulling heat out of the house. It was holding it. That visit didn't end with an argument. It ended quietly. The man left without saying much. But he didn't repeat what he'd been saying before. Within days, others came by. Builders, neighbors, people who had laughed early on. They didn't come to debate anymore. They came to feel it for themselves. And once they did, the tone changed. No one apologized. No one admitted they were wrong. They just stopped calling it a mistake. And in a place like that, silence meant more than praise ever could. Once people stopped arguing, they started counting. Winter doesn't care about opinions. It cares about numbers, temperature, fuel, time. And those numbers were hard to ignore. While most homes in the valley hovered in the low 40s during the cold snap, this one stayed in the upper 60s, not just during the day, overnight, through wind, through snow. The difference wasn't 5 degrees or 10. It was massive. Outside temperatures dropped deep below zero. Inside the house barely moved. The gap between outdoors and indoors was close to 100 degrees at the worst moments. That kind of spread didn't happen by accident. Then came the fuel comparisons. Neighbors kept records because they had to. Firewood wasn't cheap, and it wasn't easy to cut in that weather. Families burned through cords fast, sometimes a full cord in less than a week. Stoves were loaded every 3 to 4 hours, day and night. In this house, the pattern was different. One controlled burn per day, sometimes less. The masonry heater captured the energy instead of wasting it. The stone held it instead of dumping it into the ground. Over the same stretch of winter, the amount of wood used was a fraction of what everyone else needed. Less work, less fuel, more comfort. No one needed charts to understand that. People felt it in their bodies, in how they slept, in how often they had to leave the table to tend a fire. This wasn't a small improvement. It was a different category of living. And once those numbers were shared, the idea that this design was risky stopped making sense. The real risk people started to realize was doing what they'd always done and paying for it every winter. From the outside, it looked simple. From the inside, it was precise. The basement wasn't acting like a typical lower level. It wasn't a cold sink pulling heat down. It was a charged space holding steady in the low 60s while the ground outside stayed frozen solid. The masonry heater did its work early in the day. One hot, clean burn. No smoldering, no constant feeding. The fire transferred its energy into brick and stone, not into air that would vanish an hour later. Once the fire was out, the system didn't shut down. It shifted. The stone walls continued to release heat slowly. The heater mass stayed warm to the touch for most of the day. The earth floor added stability, not loss. Warm air moved up the stairwell naturally. No fans pushing it, no ductwork leaking it, just physics doing what it always does. The steel shell above didn't steal that heat. The insulation stopped it. The vapor barrier kept moisture where it belonged. The curved shape reduced surface area exposed to wind and shed snow before it could pile up. Even during the worst nights, the temperature dropped slowly, not suddenly. No sharp declines, no cold shock by morning. This was the difference people felt immediately. In most homes, the fire dictated life. When the stove cooled, the house followed. When the fire roared, rooms overheated near it and stayed cold everywhere else. Here, the house stayed ahead of the weather. It didn't need attention every few hours. It didn't punish sleep. It didn't demand constant labor just to remain livable. The system didn't fight winter hour by hour. It absorbed the cold and kept moving. And once people understood that, they stopped asking how it worked. They started asking how to build something like it themselves. The change didn't happen all at once. It started quietly. A builder would stop by just to look. A neighbor would ask a few questions about the heater. Someone else would stand in the basement longer than necessary, hands on the stone walls, feeling the warmth for themselves. People didn't argue anymore. They observed. The first to act wasn't a skeptic or a veteran builder. It was a younger carpenter who was struggling to keep his own place warm. He didn't have the money or time to copy the whole design, but he understood the principle. He dug deeper. He added stone where the wind hit hardest. He insulated from the outside instead of the inside. He built a small masonry heater instead of relying on a steel stove. The next winter, his wood use dropped sharply. His house stayed warmer. That got noticed. Others followed in pieces. One family added a stone-lined cellar under part of their house and vented it into the living space. Another insulated the outside of an existing stone foundation and stopped losing heat into frozen ground. A few builders started offering warm basements as a selling point. No one called it a revolution, but plans started changing. By the middle of the decade, arched steel kits were being ordered locally, not for barns, for homes. Stone masons adjusted how they built. Thicker walls, better separation from the ground, heat sources designed to charge mass instead of blast air. Even some of the loudest critics adapted quietly. They didn't talk about being wrong. They talked about what worked. That was how change always happened in places like that. Not through speeches or trends, but through winters that made failure obvious. One house didn't rewrite the rules of construction. It reminded people of rules they had forgotten. And once winter had proven them again, there was no going back. The hardest shift wasn't technical. It was personal. Some of the men who had criticized the build the loudest had decades in the trade. They had reputations. They had done things the same way for a long time, and those methods had fed their families. Admitting something worked better meant admitting something else hadn't, so they didn't rush it. One stonemason came back in early spring, notebook in hand. He didn't announce himself. He didn't make a show of it. He asked about wall thickness, stone size, mortar mix, how deep the earth contact really was. He didn't ask why it worked. He asked how to repeat it. That summer, his next foundation looked different. Thicker on the north side, insulated on the outside instead of the inside. A space built into the plan for a masonry heater, even if the homeowner didn't install it right away. A framing contractor who had sworn metal buildings were unlivable tried the concept on a workshop. Shallow stone walls, insulated steel shell, controlled ventilation. By January, he was heating the space with half the wood he used before. Nobody made announcements. Nobody asked for credit. They just adjusted. That was how knowledge moved in those communities. Quietly, through results. Through winters survived with less effort than the year before. The design didn't spread because it was clever. It spread because it worked, and because people were tired of fighting the same battle every year and losing ground. Once that line was crossed, tradition stopped being something you defended. It became something you refined. By the time spring arrived, the arguments were over. Not because everyone agreed, but because winter had answered the questions more clearly than words ever could. What that house proved wasn't complicated. Lightweight construction loses heat fast. Heavy mass loses heat slowly. That difference matters more than people want to admit. Most homes in the valley relied on constant input. Fire on, fire off, temperature up, temperature down. Every mistake showed up immediately. This system didn't work that way. It buffered mistakes. Miss a firing, the house stayed warm. Burn a little less wood, the temperature barely changed. Cold snap hits harder than expected. The mass absorbed the shock. That's what thermal mass does. It doesn't stop the cold from arriving. It slows how fast cold can matter. The earth helped too. Going deep changed everything. Below the frost line, winter loses its leverage. The ground becomes a stabilizer instead of a drain. And the steel shell above proved another point people resisted. Shape matters, continuity matters, air control matters. A tight envelope with fewer weak points outperformed framed houses, with more insulation but more leaks. The curved roof didn't care about wind direction. Snow didn't pile up and press inward. The structure stayed neutral while the weather spent itself outside. None of this required advanced technology. It required restraint. Building slower, building heavier, letting materials do what they're good at, instead of forcing them into roles they weren't meant for. That was the real lesson. The house didn't win because it was extreme. It won because it stopped wasting energy fighting physics and started working with it instead. What he built wasn't new. That's the part people missed at first. Stone has stored heat for thousands of years. Long before insulation rolls and forced air systems, people understood that mass mattered. The Romans heated floors and walls and let stone carry warmth long after fires went out. In Northern Europe, masonry heaters warmed homes through entire days on a single burn. Across cold regions, people dug into the earth because the ground stayed steady when the air did not. None of that was innovation. It was memory. What made this house different wasn't the materials alone. It was the combination. Old principles paired with a modern shell. Earth below, mass in the middle, a tight envelope above. each part doing its job without fighting the others. That's why it worked. Not because it was extreme, not because it was clever, but because it respected how heat actually behaves. While others chased warmth hour by hour, this house stored it. While neighbors fought drafts and cold floors, this one stayed even. While winter demanded constant effort elsewhere, here it asked very little. That's the frontier lesson. Real self-reliance isn't about suffering more than everyone else. It's about needing less effort to get the same or better result. It's about building systems that forgive mistakes instead of punishing them. The lesson isn't that everyone should build a steel arch over a stone basement. The lesson is simpler than that. Use mass, go deep, insulate from the outside, control air and moisture, store heat instead of chasing it. Those rules worked before electricity, they worked before modern fuel, and they still work now. Winter hasn't changed. Only our willingness to remember what actually works has. If you were building today, which part of this would you use? The thermal mass, the earth sheltering the masonry heater, or just the idea that comfort comes from understanding, not constant effort? Let me know where you're watching from and the coldest winter you've lived through. And if you want more real frontier techniques methods that kept people warm when failure meant real consequences, subscribe to the channel. We'll keep digging up the knowledge that never stopped working. See you next time.